The production of this video was made possible by donors to the Orchestration Online Patreon initiative. Please consider adding your support to the creation of free educational internet resources by visiting our Patreon page linked below.
Hey there, this is your orchestration tutor, Thomas Goss, welcoming you to the third and final lecture on my orchestration of Andaluza by Manuel de Falla. This, of course, is my entry to the 2021 Orchestration Challenge, but it's also a sort of a general lesson in how I would orchestrate things, and I'm hoping that these full-length lectures that I'm creating of my own interpretations of these challenge entries will stand on their own as educational materials, giving you the professional orchestrator's perspective on how to reinterpret a great piano work in a new context. We left off halfway through D with a section of furious broken octaves, and that transitions to the beginning of this slow build towards this huge explosion right in here. It's as if that opening theme is being interpreted in the grandest style. And of course, for the orchestrator, that means here's an opportunity to score a big tutti. Now, just like before, I'm going to discuss all of the problems that I saw inherent in the piano score, play you that section of the piano score, and then talk about how I orchestrated it and cover those problems, because those same problems are going to be part of my criteria in evaluating scores of people who entered this year. So the first problem that I see is not so much building a convincing tutti out of this music, because tuttis are actually quite straightforward, at least the kind of big, passionate scoring that you see in a lot of early 20th century works, which really are the foundation of a lot of film music and a lot of the kind of scoring that we're doing in these challenges. What I really wanted to work on with my orchestration was that sort of hallucinatory feel. If there was anything that I could convey as an orchestrator, a sense of the surreal, then I wanted to pursue that. On top of that, of course, there's a continuing concern about broken octaves, and if you'll agree with me that I solved the problem in the last lecture, then you may find what I did to solve it in this case acceptable. Now, after this enormous tutti, we run into another one of my pitfalls that I mentioned in the announcement video, and that was the fact that some of this scoring, which is very broken across the hands, is actually just a form of rotating patterns. And I spelled out those patterns in the piano template that I created for the Patreon entrance. So hopefully that will be some kind of a guide. But it's really not so simple, is it? Because yes, you can interpret that pattern, but that pattern can't be everything that is going on, or else the music becomes just very dull. It's just this rotating line and nothing else. And so I'm hoping that people will add more to the picture than is suggested just by this 4-note pattern. And then, of course, interpreting more broken intervals. How is that going to be done effectively? This time, those intervals are in the center of the piano's range, so it's not going to be the same thing as the broken octaves that we see here and were such a problem in the page before. So how is that going to be interpreted? Because it has all the same earmarks of creating problems that the previous section had. But all of those little technical problems aside, I feel that the two biggest challenges, at least for me as an orchestrator, were proportional ones. How do I transition from the end of this incredibly huge tutti to this very nimble, agile, still fairly strong section? Now notice that I've written forte poco here, really backing off, but still being firm and emphatic. And that is really what pianists do. If you listen to the De La Rocha version or the version by Peter Bradley Fulgoni that I've been using that is posted on IMSLP, it's the same exact approach. There's this huge searing push to triple forte and then kind of backing off. And the stuff that is being played thenceforth is not really triple F. I think that that would be brutal. And probably Falla would have backed off on the dynamics as well had he orchestrated this. The other big question too is that you'll notice intervals start to enter the picture in the right hand, and we've got some slowing down here, which actually starts way before it's marked in the piano score with most pianists' interpretations. And there's a sense when this is slowed down and you're adding intervals and so on, and having this little tie across right in here, from this E to the E on the next page, that the music is kind of coming apart at the seams a bit. It is kind of fragmenting. So how do we go from that pulling apart of the rhythmic fabric of the piece into the beautifully lyrical section that follows? So those are all the problems that I saw in this section. And I think I've mentioned before that I felt that this was the most challenging entry. More challenging than the Ravel, more challenging than the Bartok that we did a few years ago. And I think probably it's just because of looking after details like that. The actual scoring tricks that I used, those came pretty easily once I really thought about them. But managing the proportions, that's what I found tricky, and especially doing it in a way that would be convincing for notation playback, because, I mean, that is a concern in these kinds of challenges. Obviously, I'm not scoring to the playback, but I want to do something in a way that it works in both contexts, so that people get a sense of how satisfying an orchestration like this can be. So, without further ado, let's listen to the piano section, think about all of those things, the sense of the surreal in the piano, pushing to this huge tutti right in here, and then, of course, changing over to these patterns at the agitato, how to orchestrate that. Going from huge passion to feverish excitement, and then, of course, from there into our beautiful, soft, lyrical section to follow. And here we see the results of that huge tutti, and lots of big brass scoring, as you can see, but really not a ton of percussion. I'm just using some timpani in there for emphasis. And then a big old tutti chord right in here, and so on. But really, the way that I get there is what's interesting to me. I had discussed a hallucinatory feel and how important I felt it was to maintain that sense in building this tutti from the ground up. And one part of that is really the pushing and pulling of the tempo. Notice that I marked this più meno, poco rubato, and that's really what is happening there with most pianists. If I just select all here, then you can see how I tweaked the tempo right in here. Accelerando, pushing and then backing off again. Pushing and backing off, pushing and backing off. Again and again until finally there's this big rallentando at the end. So that was one way of conveying that sense. And then another is just on the choice of instruments used right in here at the beginning. So I'm starting off with that chordal melody, and it's scored pretty typically with octaves in the first violins and violas, and then the second violins covering the harmony in the middle, divisi, and everybody's starting off really soft. And to that I am adding flutes and clarinets, and I feel that that gives us a more ethereal sound than if I were to have doubled it with, say, clarinets and oboes. This is a case where, since the dynamics are so soft, the flutes will not be overwhelmed. And notice furthermore that I am doubling the top line here, third flute and first flute. And the second flute is covering the next note down in harmony, which is also covered by the second violins. And then this F right in here is being covered by the first clarinet. And then I've got the second clarinet doubling the violas. So it has a nice radiant sound that is a little bit on the cool side. Before we go any further, let's also notice that I have terraced the dynamics instead of just having this long poco a poco crescendo to fortissimo. I've really indicated what I want in each bar. Pianissimo in the first bar, piano in the second bar, mezzo piano. Then I really control where the crescendo is. Instead of having the crescendo across these two bars, I have it in this push upwards. That way, this gap has more meaning. Mezzo forte coming right in there. On the next little eighth note phrase to forte. And then finally, this big push, fortissimo, with expansion. And then that just rides at fortissimo and then pushes to triple F right there at the end of that passage. Okay. Now notice I've also tweaked some of this because there are moments in the piano where there is a big accent every two bars. So that is brought out with a forte punch in contrabassoon, timpani, and double bass. This will be double bass and contrabassoon playing an octave lower than the timpani. Really effective. And then we have the cellos answering that, an octave higher, doubled by bassoons, both of those an octave below the timpani, and then coming back, same strategy as before. I'm really kind of keeping it with that trading off between the octaves in those instruments and not adding heavy brass yet. And then by the time we get to here, it is really kind of academic, because the bass is coming in delayed by an eighth note anyways, every other bar. So we'll cover that when we get to it. But let's continue on with this interpretation. Second clarinet and A3 clarinets above. Notice I'm adding strength to that line, but easing off on the clarinets because they are going to be fine. They are doubling the octaves here in our violins. First violins, top divisi, second violins, lower second violins, doubling with the violas, and so on. And I feel that that makes a perfect combination with these instruments here, so much so that I can score the horns at piano instead of pianissimo, instead of backing them off so much. The balance is perfect for this. We have the bassoons playing this syncopated bass note along with the cellos, and that is part of the harmony that is happening here. That's an interpretation of the left hand of the piano. That strategy continues. Again, same exact placement of all of the elements in the winds and the strings. And then we've also got the horns coming in here, just like before, those lower notes in the cellos and the bassoons, and then that little race up here to where we get to a more traditional kind of doubling between winds and strings. Now, while all of this has been going on, we've had that other problem to solve, and that is the broken octaves. And at this point, I go to a very, very simple measured tremolo in the lower strings, doubled by bass clarinet. So the bass clarinet is going to be doubling the cellos, right? Remember your transposition? Down an octave plus a whole step, or you could also think of that as a major ninth. So E in the treble staff is going to be the same as D in the middle of the bass staff. And at this point, più meno, so it's going to be slightly slower, so single tonguing this measured tremolo is not going to be that big of a deal for your average good pro bass clarinetist. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. That's not a big deal. And the same thing is happening going forwards. Now here we have trombone coming in and doing the same thing. A2 trombones, our poor, neglected second trombonist is getting something to do right in there. And I don't think that'll be a problem for them either at this slower tempo. And that just takes us to this section right in here where I said that the wind and string doubling was a little bit more traditional. And it is. You can see right here we've got first violins being doubled by all the flutes, A3, if you will, A2 in the top staff, plus the third flute playing the same exact part in the staff below. Then oboes taking the middle harmonic position with clarinets, A2, doubling the violas, and of course the second violins being doubled by the oboes. So that's a pretty traditional way of doing things. But I think it makes perfect sense. And then just breaking them up into octaves. We've got first oboe doubling the flutes, and we've got the second oboe doubling the clarinets, and that all works fine, especially with this much doubling of the strings. And it also helps to create a very, very emphatic, almost sword-like cutting sound that can balance against the growing presence of the brass. Look at that a little bit. We can see that I'm actually adding trumpet to bolster up the lower notes of this harmony right in here. First trumpet, doubling the violas and the clarinets. And notice that I am really scoring this down, mezzo piano. And going through all there, I am just really dropping it one dynamic degree. And I'll talk a little bit more about that coming up. As I mentioned before, the trombones are doing measured tremolo along with the bass clarinets and the cellos on the same pitches, and then the double basses are tracking that from below. But bass trombone is just playing staccato. And I feel that that's a better approach, because I think it would just get confusing even if I could trust the bass trombone players to not be annoyed at me scoring measured tremolo below the staff. And that same pitch, of course, is being doubled by contrabassoon, and I already talked about the double basses down here. So that will keep things on track. Horns, once again, providing that same left hand, with cellos and bassoons kind of providing that bass D once again. Same thing as before, all the positions are all the same in all the instruments going forwards. Except for right here, I'm adding English horn to bolster the clarinets. Now, we're getting to some very, very fun doubling right in here. Triple flutes on top, doubling the first violins all the way through. Oboes taking the middle position on the harmony. Same exact thing here, and all those octave chords. And then, of course, violas doubled by English horn and A2 clarinets. So you can see it's really just a very familiar strategy, and yet it's really, really effective. Not just with the orchestra, but also with the mock-up, right? It is music that is very, very easy to sound effective, whether it is digital or being played in the concert hall. You probably are familiar with Rimsky-Korsakov's dictum that you should fill in the harmony as much as you can and not leave big gaps. And he's totally right in a situation like this. So, even though in our piano score we really see this big octave chord, then octave melody, and so on going on the right hand, and then octaves in the bass, and then some filling in right in here. So how do we deal with that? How do we fill things in and make it all work? So the answer is to add some harmony in the brass inside here, and then have that harmony in the brass take over this right in here, and do it in a way that it doesn't really sound just like the same thing going on and on and on. That's all just in the voicing of the chords, really, I feel. To a certain extent, that center chorale type scoring in our brass has to have a sense of integration all the way across. So we're starting off here with our G minor chord, and that is, of course, written out as a big D minor octave chord in our horns, sounding down a perfect fifth. So essentially, just kind of the same thing here, except inverted. And then right in the middle, we've got these G minor triads, and it all stacks up together very, very well. Now notice I have a little bit of ongoing support here from the first trumpet of the melodic elements, and I feel that that is incredibly vital to the way the melody stands out. Notice that I've also given support to the overtones of the syncopations right in here to our oboes. So the oboes aren't breaking into the octaves. They are pushing forwards with that ba-ba-ba-ba. And I would say that is the main trick that saves the brass from sounding too regular all the way across. First trumpet adding life and color to the melody, and oboes inhabiting the overtones from the horns and the other trumpets. But otherwise, it really is just the same thing happening going forwards all the way through in terms of all the harmonic positions and everything else. I was pretty happy with this, interpreting these octaves, and notice in the piano part, the broken octave scoring comes to an end, and it's just straight octave tenuto scoring. And that is very easily scored across trombones, and then trombone and tuba, trading off as the positions jump up and down. And of course, all just doubled by the lower winds and lower strings. But I'm still throwing in some cello and bassoon support of the syncopation right in here. Just really helping out the bottom note of the horns right in there, because there is no other lower brass instrument that can help out the way that I've scored the lower heavy brass. And this was kind of fun right in here. This huge push to the triple forte that actually doesn't have any lower heavy brass right at the end. I just felt that that was a little too much, and especially when you consider that this is the accompaniment in the left hand. I really like that sense of suspension, of that kind of passionate leap upwards in the fabric of the piano scoring, from these low F sharps all the way up to these huge chords right in here, which you'll hear that De La Rocha has to roll in order to play, as she has smaller hands. But it's all interpreted fairly much the same across all of these other instruments, and in keeping with what happened before. Especially with these oboes right in here, supporting the overtones of the syncopated brass, and the first trumpet providing a bass to the octave melody. And then that just leads to this massive chord right in here. Notice in the piano scoring, it's really, really widely spread. So I had to fill everything in, and that can be a little project for you if you're really interested to see how I added certain pitches. You can see them here. This diminished fifth right in here, D sharp and A, and some of the scoring in the trumpets and horns to just really fill things in rather than having things being so separated. So that takes us to how to transition to the very agile forte section. And I hope you'll bear with me in just a few more bars before I play this section for you. As you'll recall, part of our problem in orchestrating this is the fact that there are patterns and there's fragmented scoring, and it won't quite work if it's transcribed in terms of the pitches. You'll sort of lose that sense of impulse. So I interpreted the broken octaves with pizzicato in violas and cellos at an octave apart, and I interpreted the pattern right in here with trading off first violins and second violins. I think that's a real kind of fun way to break it up. And those are being doubled by the clarinets. And that enters the picture following a cesura, which is so important, right? We were going bum 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 bum, right? That gives the music a little bit of a breathing space, so it isn't jumping directly to the next thing. Meanwhile, English horn is being told to change to the oboe d'amore. Just bookmark that, because that is going to be much more important. Here I have pretty much scored out the accented staccato as staccatissimo notes in our second violins and first bassoon in tenor clef. So those notes are doubling. Really, really cool doubling, actually, between second violins playing on their fourth string and first bassoon. And then staccatissimo, but not quite so abrupt, right in here in our violas and cellos. Now, the effect is going to be fairly much the same, with the cellos doubling what's going on in the second violins, and the violas basically covering the upper intervals, keeping things on track, I feel. And they're playing the exact same pitches as the first violins, which are playing measured tremolo on that. And that's very simple for them. And then I am borrowing a trick from my approach to the bassoons on the previous screen and having them and giving that to the oboes so that they've got 5 notes of single tonguing in a row that's traded off between each instrument. And I feel that that is the way forward. That is how to interpret this right in here. And I also think it's kind of cool to bring the sound picture down to just the strings and a little bit of doubling in the winds. Just because with fewer players working together in a very, very passionate way, you get an effect that you don't when the entire orchestra is playing. There's a sense of furiousness and of joined force that is more intimate. Now here on the next screen, you can see that I have continued that same approach. The clarinets looping around, trading off those notes that are being played, this time between violas and first violins. And I am adding some pizzicato emphasis to the first note of each little beam group in our first violins. And then cellos below, really pushing at that with nice, firm accents. And notice this little B fifth right in here. I am interpreting that right here in the double basses, with doubling by our contrabassoon and bass clarinet, which I feel make a really great team. They are beautifully complementary, just the same way that bassoon and clarinet are beautifully complementary. So just drop everything an octave with contrabassoon and bass clarinet, and you get some of the same effect, even richer and darker. And I feel just as capable at blending together in things like octaves, fifths, and so on. Now here's a lot of the same approach that I used before, this time with a real abrupt pizzicato. So here I've got staccatissimo added to pizzicato, and I feel that in this case, that adding that to the pizzicato is not a contradiction, because I just want that to be really dry and really pointy. But it works together with all the other elements, the staccatissimo in cellos, and the very, very abrupt second violin. And of course, we've got that same measured tremolo in first violin being doubled with alternating oboes, and the first bassoon doubling the second violin, and so on. And right here, things start to pull apart as we slow down and go into the next section, which was the whole puzzle. How do I gracefully transition from this sort of furiously pointy section into a very calm and beautiful section? I feel that there is no perfect way to do that, but this is my attempt right in here. And that is to have certain longer durations on some notes, adding slurring to the patterns so several notes are under one bow. And that is coinciding with the diminuendo, and of course, we're being helped out in that way by the slowing down of the tempo. And adding the oboes right in here. Now notice, just as we saw with Falla in that masterclass that I released a few weeks ago, not every pitch has to be doubled by winds that is happening in the strings. In fact, it's better to have fewer, and that way, when we give over to this very lush, simple string scoring, it's much easier to control for all the players. Okay, so I've talked about this quite enough. Why don't you have a listen to it now, and then I will return with the very, very final bit of piano scoring and talk about the problems in that need fixing. And now for the final section from Rehearsal E. Now, I want to comment a little bit on a slight irregularity of these rehearsal marks. They are really more for delineating certain sections that would be orchestrated by my Patreon supporters. They are not really functional rehearsal marks, because I would probably add more and move some of them around from where they are. And of course, I wouldn't put a rehearsal mark at the beginning of the piece. So, while they may seem arbitrary from time to time about where a finalized score for a normal performance might be placed, they are really just functional in terms of me telling people how much to score at what level of support. Okay, so don't worry about that. However, in the case of this one, I would definitely be placing a rehearsal mark right here, because this is the beginning of this beautiful section with this lovely melody, very, very simple, effective scoring. This lyrical melody and wonderful accompaniment, once again, of a rotating pattern. So the question is obvious, just like we had before in the previous lecture when there was a lyrical section. How to authentically interpret that in a way that really feels like the composer's intention. And I'm sure that most of you have already noticed that I am choosing to use oboe d'amore, and I'll talk about why when we check out the orchestral screen of this section. However, that is a concern, and I actually don't use oboe d'amore all the way through. I make some other decisions, and of course, other elements come in from time to time. So I don't use oboe d'amore across everything. And there's this other concern as well, and that is these rotating patterns. The rotating patterns evolved into this beautiful, lush kind of accompaniment. How can I score that in a way that doesn't get boring, right? That isn't just the same instruments over and over and over again. How can I add some variety into that so it really feels natural and it feels inspiring and it doesn't just feel humdrum? You probably have already guessed that I'm going to be using harp here. And if I do that, how do I keep the harp from being too regular, from being too predictable? Then we get to this section right in here, in which we've got triple P and the French word for distant, right? So we have this very beautifully distant, very beautifully icy kind of callback to the very first 4 bars of the piece. So how do I interpret that? Do I just do whatever I want to right there? Or do I try to interpret the coloration of the piano? Because the piano has a really beautiful color, and it has a wonderful variety of colors that are possible, shadings and degrees and so on of nuance that really have different orchestral interpretations. So how do I stay true to that? And then we are going from distance to intimacy to suspense. How am I going to manage that in terms of my proportions? How do I make it feel really natural going forwards into this, and then just give way to a sense of the mysterious? Now, that is not the only problem, because we've got this little coda section here at the end, this suspenseful coda, and how do I keep that proportional? There is always the temptation when arranging music like this to just take the ending and make it something really huge, because this is the last chance that you're going to get to say anything with the orchestra. So is that something that should happen, or should we try to stay true to the music and to help the music wind down in exactly the way that Falla imagined it for piano? And then once again, we end with this beautiful sort of chink of light. Maybe this being similar to Nights in the Gardens of Spain, and definitely being something very nocturnal. Maybe it's a bit of starlight, or maybe it is the dawn starting to break. There are a bunch of different ways to interpret it, and of course Falla was very resistant to all of them. He loved writing programmatic music. If you have ever attended a performance of The Three-Cornered Hat, that is an example, or El Amor Brujo. Those are all examples of direct application of music to dramatic situations. However, in his evocative scoring, he wanted to be more impressionistic than directly descriptive. So while we can imagine the influence of things like the dawn breaking or the stars coming out or the moonlight or whatever, we can't really directly force them onto the music any more than it would be proper to say the little jokes out loud that Eric Satie wrote on the edges of his piano manuscripts while you're playing them. So, with all of that in mind, let's have a listen to this section of the piano scoring and think about all those things. How can I be authentic in interpreting this piano melody? How can I keep these beautiful rotating patterns from becoming too regular, too predictable? How can I interpret this beautiful icy little callback right in here? And how can I manage the different emotional proportions from that distance to this intimacy to a sense of mysterious suspense? And how can I keep this proportional to the way the music is winding up? And how do I finish with that beautiful little ray of light at the end? Answers to those questions coming up right after this. And now for the final section of this series of orchestration lectures. Let's see how I solved all those problems. And before we do that, let's talk a little bit more about the way that I had to solve the problem of wrapping up this very, very vibrant, very, very edgy, leaping around kind of scoring, moving forward into very soft lyrical scoring. I talked a little bit about how I started to have longer note values and slurs and everything else. But also part of the trick was built into the approach that I had for this passage to follow. And that was to not just have the harp come in and play this lovely accompaniment right in here, but to also have the strings continue on very, very softly backing up the harmony that is going on under the melody and inside this rotating pattern. But let's talk about these problems in the same order that I presented them. Authentic melodic voice, and all along you have noticed that I have been talking about how the oboe d'amore is going to eventually show up, and here it is. And I feel that this is absolutely the perfect place to use it. Now, I am hedging my bets as well in writing out that part to be covered by the first oboe player if it is impossible to find an oboe d'amore instrument to be played. However, I'm assuming that the English horn player will be able to play it with no problem. And I really kind of would rather have the third oboe player playing this anyways. I kind of want it to come from below rather than from above, if you see what I mean. Not that it would make a huge difference anyways which player played this, because most oboe players will be able to play the d'amore with no problem at all. In fact, the principal oboist for New Zealand Symphony Orchestra, possibly the greatest oboe player in Australasia, did the oboe d'amore demos for my Orchestration 102 series. So it doesn't really have to be your auxiliary specialist who plays it. However, since that player has been playing English horn throughout, and now they've switched over to oboe d'amore again, I feel that it's kind of fun to give them a chance and to hear their insights on it and to encourage that particular player. So that is the situation right in here, and also just the beautiful sound of that instrument. Very, very sweet sound. It can also be almost a little too sweet at times. Cloying and cutesy even. But in this case, I feel that it's very sincere. It has a very direct way of interpreting these kinds of solos. And if all else fails, just have the first oboist play it, and they'll be perfectly fine in this beautiful middle register scoring for the oboe. Now, that leads to our second problem, and that is rotating patterns, maintaining interest, not being too regular, and of course, I ended up using the harp on this. And notice that I've scored the harp pretty much in a way that splits up the left hand right in here of the piano part in an almost exact copy. However, I start to vary things right in here a little bit, just throwing in a couple of notes an octave higher, and then just helping things to climb into other registers and then climb back down. And I feel that that's a really wonderful way of bringing in the next melodic voice and bringing in the next accompaniment strategy, which I'll discuss in a minute. But before I do, let's once again point out the fact that the strings are giving way from the previous section into these harmonies right in here. And it's just a very simple way of keeping the music soft and giving, right? I want it to be very generous in here without being overpowering. Everybody's playing pretty much pianissimo right in here, or piano, and it is keeping things in a place where it's really just an adjunct to the harmony that's coming out of the patterns in the harp. However, here I use that same presence of these instruments, pushing forward just slightly into mezzo piano, and having the cello kind of hang on this low B that is part of the patterns, just the same way that that B is going to be the longest string and the most prominent bass element in the piano playing. I'm just going to make use of that here in having a very simple low B note while the pattern is being interpreted. And in this case right in here, notice that I'm using the same exact way of scoring it in terms of notation that is being used between the two parts in the left hand of the piano part. However, I am also interpreting those patterns directly with doubling in the clarinets. Now, here is a place where I felt that the playback did not do the greatest job. The clarinets should really mix seamlessly into the middle strings right in here, and there was kind of a sense of staccato a little bit, which you may notice when I play it again. Occasionally, Note Performer interpreted these beautiful connected phrases as boop 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 rather than duh. So Watch out for that. That is not intentional. It's not the way that it's supposed to go. As this all gets started and this beautiful cushioning takes over from the harp, and the harp is supposed to just blend seamlessly into it. Very, very easy for a harpist to do as they go down to a piano against strings and winds at piano and mezzo piano. The first violins and A2 flutes take over on the melody, and I feel that is also very authentic to Falla. It's having a kind of a cooler sound once again, doubling it with middle register flutes, but not too cool. Middle register flute has this wonderful combination between the darker sound of the low register and the brighter sound of the upper register. So you don't get the same effect in terms of coolness that you would if it were, say, doubled by clarinets. The clarinets are already cooling down this repeated pattern right in here. So the flutes do keep it cool, but they don't keep it icy. And that really concludes the main statement. And there's just one tiny little fragment of melody to follow. And I give that back to the oboe d'amore. And notice that I just let it come to an end because there's this little change of harmony right in here. And that does not go along with F sharp sounding, right? We have F double sharp, and I did not want to hold on to the sounding F sharp and then change it to F double sharp. I felt that that would just be really obvious. Notice there's also an adjustment right in here. Normally I tell people that if something is a double sharp or a double flat that makes sense within the harmony of the piano part, to bring those double sharps and double flats into your scoring, especially with strings, because it makes sense to them in terms of how they finger things. However, in harp, they do not work. Anybody out there who put an F double sharp into their harp part, I haven't seen your scores yet, but if you did, that's not possible on harp. The double action harp can only go sharp, natural, and flat. So, anyway, that's why there is a G natural here instead of an F double sharp. And just a little bit more cushion right in here as the harp takes over. Now notice the harp dropped out, the strings took over with the clarinets on the patterning, and of course I had a little bit of cello right in there to kind of root everything in a nice subtle way. And that way I can have the harp emerge again, which I feel works really, really great. It comes back, and it also has that kind of hint of guitar playing that can be used really nicely in music that has a Spanish feel to it. Now this comes together at the tail end of a bit of long ritardando right in here, and I throw in another cesura because what follows is our icy little scoring right in there, our distant piano callback to the opening bars. This is the kind of scoring that I live for. How to solve those problems. And in this case, I felt it was really obvious what to do. First of all, just interpreting all of these things, I'm leaving the grace notes to the clarinets because I don't feel that it is the most essential kind of thing. And also, as you might remember me saying a couple of lectures ago, when you throw in this kind of thing, a tied grace note on the upper voice, you end up confusing the rest of the orchestra because they don't know where the downbeat is. You're kind of messing them up. So it's better to have either fairly obvious changes of pitch in your grace notes in orchestral scoring, or have the grace notes occur a little bit lower. All right. So we've got our little stack right in here, E octaves with an A in the middle. So how to interpret that? In the first place, both E and A are nice, open, natural harmonics on violins. So this is the octave node for the E string. That is the octave node for the A string. So really, really simple scoring. As to the viola, they can play the lower E as an artificial harmonic 2 octaves down. And they can also throw in an F natural just by moving up one step. And that's how I also get the C natural in the middle right in here by my second violins. As to the F, I just have the first violinist play flautando with non-vibrato, right? So I just really want everything to be as cool and as icy as possible. Now, before I talk about the lower pitches, let's see how all of this is being doubled above. Here's a place where flute harmonics work really, really well. And in case you're not sure what that is, they are flute pitches that are being played on the third partial, and they have a very hollow kind of a sound. It's pretty easy just to tell the flute player to play that with the harmonic marking, and you will end up with that very, very distant sound. Notice that I am giving the piccolo player a doubling with the artificial harmonics of the viola. And they're playing non-vibrato. So that works beautifully well as well. And one last little bit of doubling on this entire part is glockenspiel playing the same pitch as this first violin and first flute part. I don't want it to be too loud. This is the kind of thing where I'm hoping that the conductor will balance this so that the glockenspiel isn't everything that you hear. It should just be a little bit of color right in there, but I didn't want to mark it pianissimo because I felt that that is just a little too much in the background. These pitches down here, G sharp and C sharp, can easily be played as artificial harmonics 2 octaves down in Divisi cellos. And if you'll recall that I was talking about how clarinets have a cooler kind of a sound, we've got that same thing happening here with the clarinets playing pianissimo this time. I want them really in the background so that they don't overwhelm the sound of these artificial harmonics. And that's how I solved that problem. Now, getting from icy to intimate to mysterious. I chose to do that using instruments that would contrast in a way that felt inevitable. We're coming back to one last little bit of trumpet solo. Bum, ba-da-da-dum. And supporting that with clarinets. So the clarinets are taking that kind of direct, cooler sound, and that is a carryover from some of the ice of the previous bars. And yet, they have a very comfortable, close sound in the way that they are accompanying the trumpet. And to even add to that, pianissimo clarinets fading out by the time we get to here, but bass clarinet increasing, and that slightly creepy sound of bass clarinet is perfect for setting up the suspense of the next section. And that is harmonized, these two notes, the same in clarinets, and then our suspenseful section can follow. So that is how I solved that problem. So our last two problems are keeping the coda proportional and ending the piece with that same kind of beautiful ray of light and distance and everything else. Here, I kept it as simple as I possibly could. Pizzicato interpreting those low staccato notes along with tuba. And tuba is really, really great for this kind of scoring because it has just this natural punch to it, especially in staccato. And it is a character that is quite different from contrabassoon and bassoon. I felt that this was just the absolute perfect place to bring that in, and especially the clarity on these lower pitches and the tenuto staccato right in here. Then on the little syncopations above, that is perfect for our cellos and the bass clarinet going forwards. And it's a good way to swallow that sound and make it a part of the next section. Now, as for the ba-da-dum, 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 I felt that that would work perfectly with a trio of horns and tremolo strings. Notice, though, that I have the strings jump up an octave, and that keeps things from being too regular and repetitive. And then, of course, everything joins together in unison right in here and continues onwards to a very, very soft pianissimo, diminuendo, here diminuendo to pianissimo, and just really tailing off. And allowing bass clarinet, tuba, and lower strings to kind of hang on this low E fifth for a second. Now, we get to that last problem. Ba-bum, bum. How to score that. Now, I kind of wanted that sort of sense of pastoral color. I am teaming my second violins and violas up with oboes and clarinets, and I feel that that has that woody sound to it, kind of verdant, green, growing sound. Now, as they're holding that sort of warmer pitch right there in the middle, we've got the other elements coming in, and right here, a very, very simple E fifth, which can actually be played non-divisi on the top two strings. That's really easy to get. That is being doubled by the same pitches, this B up above, pianissimo non-vibrato, and E and B below in our flutes. And that, of course, is doubling the B right in here on the second flute. A bit of harp right in there. Notice the little bracket that I'm using here. And, of course, B in the glockenspiel. So those are our higher pitches, and there'll be this kind of gleaming color. And then below, I have chosen to leave the center open, as it is in the piano scoring. So we've got our E octave and a fifth below. I want that sense of slight murk that you would get from scoring that exactly as it is. So divisi basses playing the E fifth with the cellos on top, doubled by our bassoon family instruments. I hope you've enjoyed this series of lectures. This is kind of a new way of presenting my version of the Orchestration Challenge selection. And it was kind of nice to take more time, to not just cram everything down into an hour and 15 minutes like I have in the past. And of course, this is a longer excerpt than we've had before, so that kind of makes me turn it into a trilogy. And I hope I'm not mirroring the slightly suspect motives of producers who take a single book and turn it into a massive trilogy with a huge battle at the end. That's not my intention at all. My intention more is to introduce you to a lot of the ideas and techniques and approaches that I used in order to solve the problems that I am going to be evaluating in everybody else's scores. And that's only fair. I'm trying to keep this as fair as possible, even though I realize that people do not suspect me of being unfair. But more because that is the way I would want it if I were a young composer coming into a challenge like this. I would want to know that the person evaluating me had also made at the challenge themselves, that they had solved some of those problems, and that I could compare my efforts to theirs and decide for myself whether or not that person had made a fair evaluation of my work. So that is why I am presenting these lectures in so much detail. And also just for the fun of it. It's really fun to talk about it and to explain why I did something rather than why some other composer did something. I can only guess sometimes why a composer decided to do one thing or another. But in this case, I totally know why I did what I did. And explaining that to you opens up those techniques and approaches in your scoring. This is all about making everybody out there a stronger orchestrator. That is my overriding motive in presenting these challenges to you. And I hope that this one is worth watching if you're just an observer, and worth having entered if you were one of the participants. Thanks everybody so much for your involvement, for being part of the Orchestration Online community, for my supporters on Patreon who totally made this possible. There would be no way that I could have set aside the time to talk about this in the detail that it required and present it as an educational resource to you if it wasn't for them. So thank you, everybody. And now for the evaluations.